They gunned down crowds. They left cities in terror. And when the justice system caught up with them, they faced the ultimate sentence, death. But what did these mass killers do in their final hours? What did they eat? What were their last words? In this video, we uncover the chilling end of America's most notorious mass shooters, those who were executed by the state. Before we get into these harrowing stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more true crime investigations. Tap the notification bell so you don't miss any updates on the darkest corners of the American justice system. Timothy McVeigh, Indiana. Timothy McVeigh's name is forever linked to one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in American history. On the morning of April 19, 1995, he parked a Ryder truck filled with explosives outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. At precisely 9:02 a.m., the bomb detonated, ripping through the structure and killing 168 people, including 19 young children who were attending daycare inside the building. More than 600 others were injured in the blast. The bombing was not an impulsive act of violence. McVeigh, a decorated Gulf War veteran, meticulously planned the attack as an act of revenge against the federal government, citing the 1993 Waco siege and the Ruby Ridge standoff as motivations. He believed the government had overstepped its bounds and sought to send a message in the most destructive way possible. The aftermath was catastrophic. Emergency responders described the scene as a war zone. The blast destroyed 1/3 of the building, crushed dozens of vehicles, and left a massive crater in the street. It was, at the time, the deadliest act of terrorism ever committed on U.S. soil, and remained so until September 11, 2001. After a lengthy investigation, authorities traced the bombing back to McVeigh through a vehicle identification number found on an axle from the exploded truck. He was arrested just 90 minutes after the bombing for driving without license plates and possessing an unregistered concealed weapon. Days later, the full extent of his involvement became known. McVeigh was tried in federal court and found guilty on 11 counts, including conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and the intentional killing of federal law enforcement personnel. He was sentenced to death in 1997. McVeigh was executed by federal lethal injection at the U.S. Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, on June 11, 2001. This marked the first federal execution in the United States since 1963. Heightened security measures surrounded the event, and hundreds of survivors and victims, family members watched the execution via closed-circuit television. In a move that some interpreted as eerily casual, McVeigh requested a simple last meal, 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. The cold dessert stood in stark contrast to the emotional heat surrounding the execution. He made no effort to embellish or dramatize his request, offering no explanation for the choice. It was a quiet, almost detached selection from a man who had caused so much pain. Timothy McVeigh chose not to speak any final words at his execution. When given the opportunity to make a last verbal statement, he remained silent. However, he had prepared a handwritten copy of the Victorian poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley, which he left behind for prison officials to release after his death. The final lines of the poem read, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." The selection of Invictus, Latin for unconquered, was a deliberate act of defiance. Through the poem, McVeigh framed himself as unrepentant and unbowed, even in the face of death. It was a chilling conclusion to the life of a man who had orchestrated a massacre that tore through the heart of America. John Allen Muhammad, Virginia. John Allen Muhammad, widely known as the D.C. Sniper, was the mastermind behind one of the most terrifying killing sprees in modern American history. Alongside his 17-year-old accomplice, Lee Boyd Malvo, Muhammad executed a series of meticulously calculated shootings that left 10 people dead and several others critically wounded. The killing spree began in October 2002 and spanned across Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. Victims were gunned down at random, at gas stations, in parking lots, on sidewalks, creating widespread panic. Ordinary routines like pumping gas or walking across a parking lot became acts of fear. The 2 attackers used a modified blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice from which Malvo would crawl into the trunk and shoot through a hole near the license plate, turning the vehicle into a mobile sniper's nest. Over the course of 3 weeks, Muhammad and Malvo killed 10 people and injured 3 others. The victims ranged in age, race, and gender, which added to the randomness and horror of the attacks. Schools went into lockdown, public events were canceled, and people avoided outdoor activities, gripped by terror. Law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions coordinated an intensive manhunt. The turning point came on October 24, 2002, when Muhammad and Malvo were arrested while sleeping in their vehicle at a rest stop in Maryland. Inside the trunk, police found the Bushmaster XM-15 rifle used in the shootings. Prosecutors later revealed that Muhammad had planned to extort $10 million from the U.S. government in exchange for ending the attacks. There were also disturbing claims that he intended to train children, including Malvo, to become terrorists in a wider campaign of violence. Muhammad was tried in Virginia for the murder of Dean Harold Myers, one of the victims shot at a gas station in Prince William County. He was convicted in 2003 and sentenced to death. His co-defendant, Malvo, was sentenced to life without parole due to his age at the time of the crimes. John Allen Muhammad was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarratt, Virginia. The execution took place on November 10, 2009, after years of appeals had been exhausted. His execution brought a measure of closure to many victims' families, though some still struggled with the scale of the loss he caused. Security was tight on the night of the execution. Over 20 relatives of the victims were granted the opportunity to witness it, and outside the prison, a small crowd of onlookers and reporters gathered. Muhammad requested a relatively modest final meal. He was served chicken breast with red sauce, accompanied by vegetables and a dessert cake. There was no indication that he shared the symbolic or ritualistic intentions that some condemned inmates place on their last meals. He ate quietly and made no comment. In stark contrast to the chaos and noise of his crimes, Muhammad chose to meet death in silence. When asked if he had any final words, he said nothing. Witnesses to the execution reported that he remained calm and composed, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead until he closed them as the drugs began to take effect. For many watching, his silence spoke volumes. There was no apology, no justification, no mention of his victims or his accomplice. Just silence. In the end, John Allen Muhammad left this world in the same chilling manner he had haunted it, deliberate, calculated, and without remorse. His execution closed one of the darkest chapters in post-9/11 American criminal history, a reminder of how terror can come not only from afar, but from within. Gilbert Ray Postel, Oklahoma. Gilbert Ray Postel was executed for one of the most brazen and cold-blooded mass killings in Oklahoma's recent history, a quadruple homicide carried out on Memorial Day in 2005. At just 18 years old at the time of the crime, Postel joined his brother and father in an armed attack that left 4 people dead in a matter of minutes. The incident stemmed from a tragic motorcycle crash that had injured Postel's father months earlier. The family believed, though with no hard evidence, that one of the men involved in the crash had done it intentionally. Seeking revenge, Postel and his accomplices decided to take matters into their own hands. On the morning of May 30, 2005, Postel and his group armed themselves with assault rifles and rode dirt bikes to a trailer home in Del City, Oklahoma. Without warning, they opened fire. Postel fired at least 30 rounds himself, killing 4 men: James Swindle, James Vann, Terry Smith, and William Andrews. 2 of the victims died instantly, while the others were executed at close range as they attempted to flee. The attack was described by prosecutors as an ambush-style execution driven by rage and reckless vengeance. Investigators later found more than 60 spent shell casings at the crime scene. The massacre sent shockwaves through the community, both for its brutality and for the lack of remorse shown by those responsible. Though Postel's defense team claimed he had brain damage, a low IQ, and suffered from methamphetamine addiction at the time of the killings, the jury was unmoved. In 2008, he was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He would spend the next 14 years on death row at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. On February 17, 2022, Postel was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. His execution marked the fourth carried out in the state after Oklahoma resumed capital punishment in late 2021, following a 6-year moratorium due to botched executions and legal challenges. Despite appeals raising questions about his mental competency and past drug use, courts upheld his conviction and sentence. His legal team argued that his neurological condition made him less culpable, but the state insisted the killings were deliberate, organized, and malicious in nature. Postel made a detailed request for his final meal, opting for fast food from McDonald's. His order included 20 chicken nuggets, 3 large fries, 2 chicken sandwiches, a large cola, and a caramel frappe. The sizable order reflected either a sense of indulgence before death or a familiar comfort for a man who had spent nearly half his life behind bars. When given the opportunity to speak, Gilbert Postel declined to make a final statement. Witnesses said he appeared calm and unemotional. He remained silent as the drugs began to take effect, and he was pronounced dead shortly after. His execution, like the crime itself, stirred debate in Oklahoma and beyond. Supporters of the death penalty viewed it as justice finally delivered, while opponents raised concerns about mental health, substance abuse, and the age at which Postel committed his crimes. In the end, the man who once rained bullets in a burst of violent vengeance exited life without a single word, leaving only memories of the lives he took and a final meal fit for a teenager, not a killer. Maurice Oscar Byrd, Missouri. Maurice Oscar Byrd's case stands as one of Missouri's most brutal mass killings in a commercial setting. On May 21, 1980, Byrd entered Pope's Cafeteria in Kansas City, armed with a firearm, intent on robbing the establishment. But what began as a robbery quickly escalated into a cold-blooded execution. Inside the building, Byrd forced 4 employees, 2 men and 2 women, into a walk-in freezer. There, without hesitation or mercy, he shot each of them in the head at close range. The victims were later discovered by co-workers in what police described as a slaughter scene. None of the victims resisted or attempted to escape, leading investigators to conclude that the killings were purely execution style. Byrd was arrested shortly after the murders, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Authorities recovered the murder weapon and tied Byrd to the scene through witness testimony and physical evidence. During trial proceedings, the prosecution painted a picture of a man who carried out the killings with full intent and extreme malice. The defense offered no justification or mental health claim that could sway the jury's decision. In 1981, Byrd was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Over the following decade, he filed multiple appeals and sought clemency, but his conviction and sentence were upheld at every level. His crime was consistently cited as one of the most senseless and violent workplace massacres in Missouri's modern history. Maurice Byrd was executed by lethal injection on August 23, 1991, at the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. His death marked a significant moment in Missouri's capital punishment timeline, as the state had only recently resumed executions in 1989 after a long pause. Security was high on the day of the execution, and the families of the victims were given the option to witness the proceedings. Though public demonstrations were minimal, the media presence was strong, reflecting public interest in a case that had shaken Kansas City over a decade earlier. For his final meal, Byrd made one of the more elaborate requests on Missouri's death row. He asked for a combination of lobster and steak, bacon, shrimp fried rice, and chicken breast. The meal was delivered without issue, and Byrd reportedly consumed it without comment. The indulgent variety of food selections suggested either a final moment of personal comfort or a calculated show of detachment. In either case, the meal served as a stark contrast to the violence and cruelty of his crime. Byrd chose not to deliver a public final statement. Witnesses inside the chamber reported that he remained silent throughout the procedure. He did not acknowledge the witnesses, make a gesture of remorse, or offer any explanation for his actions. His quietness in death was markedly different from the horror he created in life. There were no apologies to the families of the victims, no words of reflection, and no signs of emotional reckoning. In the end, Maurice Oscar Byrd died without a sound, leaving behind 4 grieving families and a legacy of violence that still echoes in Missouri's criminal history. Randall Greenawalt, Arizona. Randall Greenawalt was a convicted killer whose name became synonymous with one of the bloodiest and most terrifying prison escape sprees in Arizona history. In 1978, while serving a life sentence for a double murder, Greenawalt was involved in a daring and violent escape orchestrated by Gary Tyson, a fellow inmate whose 3 sons helped break him out of prison during a planned visit. Once free, Greenawalt and Tyson embarked on a ruthless rampage across Arizona and into Colorado. Over the course of 11 days, they murdered 6 innocent people, including an entire vacationing family and a newlywed couple. The killings were cold-blooded, calculated, and carried out with no regard for human life. The motive appeared to be simple: silence witnesses and take what they needed: vehicles, weapons, and supplies. One of the most horrifying moments came when the group encountered the Lyons family, who had stopped to offer assistance near Quartzsite, Arizona. The family, including a young child, was forced out of their vehicle and later found dead in the desert, shot execution style. Days later, 2 more victims were added to the tally: John and Donalda Johnson, a Colorado couple who were carjacked and murdered near Flagstaff. Eventually, the deadly journey ended in a shootout with police. Gary Tyson died in the desert while attempting to escape, and his sons were arrested. Randall Greenawalt was captured, tried, and sentenced to death for his role in the killings. Prosecutors described the spree as a rolling slaughter, and it shocked the nation. The case highlighted serious flaws in the Arizona prison system and fueled debates about inmate visitation privileges and public safety. On January 23, 1997, Randall Greenawalt was executed by lethal injection at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. He had spent nearly 2 decades on death row, during which he maintained a relatively quiet profile compared to the brutal headlines that once defined him. His execution was attended by media, state officials, and family members of the victims. For many, it marked the end of a long and painful chapter. Greenawalt's last meal was modest, almost mundane. He requested 2 cheeseburgers, French fries, coffee, and milk from the prison cafeteria. Unlike some inmates who make elaborate or symbolic food choices, his selection seemed simple, perhaps reflecting a sense of resignation or emotional detachment as his final day approached. Greenawalt's final words were surprising to some and deeply spiritual in tone. As the lethal drugs began to take effect, he said, "I have prayed for you many times, and the Lord is using you well. Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." His words were directed, in part, toward the prison officials and the victims' families who witnessed the execution. While he did not offer a direct apology or confession, his tone suggested a level of acceptance and calm. Whether his statement was meant to ease the pain of those left behind or to provide himself comfort in death remains unclear. In the end, Randall Greenawalt left behind a legacy of death and destruction, 6 lives lost during a merciless killing spree. Yet he exited the world with soft words, in stark contrast to the horrors that marked his life outside prison walls. Which of these stories shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. If you want to hear more unsettling true crime stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Justice has many faces, some of them unforgettable.